Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the last part of the Legacy of the Holocaust series with George Greenwald and I. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing the events right after the Holocaust had ended for my grandfather, or right after World War II was essentially over for uh, the area where my grandfather was at. The Romanians and the Soviets have already captured the area that he was in, and we're now pushing the Germans back farther and farther towards Germany and Austria. So, where did we leave off exactly?
Okay, well, I I think that from this point on, it's very difficult to give you a chronological history of what happened. But at least the war was over. The camps were liberated by the Allies, and by Allies I mean some by Americans, some by Russians, some by the British. Um, and We then went to, first of all, back to the town where my grandparents came from. The name of that town is Vranov. And we, during the next, let's see, from 1945 until about April of 1947, we spent time in that town, in back in Košice for a while, and also in a region over near Bratislava, which is now the capital of Slovakia. It was always about the second major city in Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
And that area is called Banska Bystrica, which roughly translates that it's a mining area. It has become now a much bigger region than it was at that time. It was kind of semi farming kind of a region, and there was a lot of mining going on in there too. But for the most part, it was uh, occupied by farmers and by people raising sheep, and so it was a very pretty area of town. Uh, so let me start with Vranov. There when were there, we were staying with an aunt and uncle who also survived by hiding out in the mountains.
Hmm.
And they had a house in that town. And my grandparents' house had been occupied by the Russians and by and the rooms were then uh, lived in by a number of people, and so we really couldn't move into that house.
Mm.
Although it was a very nice, large house and so on. But the relatives, their house was intact, and nobody was living there, and so we were able to move in with them, and were visited by at different times by one was my mother's brother, who had come to the United States prior to the war, just prior to, I mean, he and his younger sister, there were 5 children altogether, and he and his younger sister came to the United States in 1941, just on the last ship that was allowed into the U.S., and just barely made it into the country. Anyway, he joined the Army because of his education as an attorney. he was promoted very quickly he was an officer, and I think a first lieutenant, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
So as soon as he heard that where we were, he drove a Jeep with a little trailer behind it and brought all kinds of canned foods and all sorts of supplies. He didn't know what we had and what we didn't have, so he came there to visit us. And about a month later, a son of the couple that we were staying with, their son also was an officer. Same situation. He also came to the United States, but quite a bit earlier. And he was also an officer, and he came and visited us,
Mm-hmm.
and also brought things for us to eat. It's the first time that we got to eat corned beef hash, and that was really quite a and spam. Oh, that was the other thing, was spam. We had never, we didn't know what it was. Anyway, I stayed there, and for the first time, I was able to go to school for a very short time. Realized that by this time I was 8, 9 years old, and I had never been to school. Although I learned quite a bit, I was reading and mostly home educated, but by the time I was 4.5 years old, I was reading books.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, I went to school there for a little while. The Russians were everywhere, and they were passing out pamphlets to the schools, pamphlets which taught basic Russian.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned a fair amount of Russian in those few months that we were there. We then spent some time in Košice trying to see if we could recover any of the belongings that we left behind in the apartment. My mother was able to get some pieces of furniture which were of no use to us,
Mm-hmm.
that the neighbors had taken. And for the most part, we were not able to do anything except to rent a small room where we stayed for a while. There also, I attempted to go to school, but not having had any prior schooling, they would not accept me in the school. And one of the interesting sidelights of that stay in Košice was that the people who were the Gentiles that were of course stayed there, looked at us with and spoke to us in a way to say, "What are you doing back here? You were supposed to have been killed by the Germans.
Yeah.
You dirty Jews, you're back here again." I'll tell you something about that in just a moment, but let me go on to Banska Bystrica. My Illy's husband, and his brother and brother's wife, the three people who were in the hayloft, all wound up in Banska Bystrica working to repair bridges. They were both engineers, and they were working on ways to repair roads, bridges, railroads, all the various things that were destroyed during the war in that part of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So we stayed with them for quite some time, and I got to be relatively good friends with the neighbor children, and we walked couple of miles to school, and I did get to go to school there for some time. And even though I was probably the best student of the group that attended that school, the anti-Semitism that went on even there was very, very still prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
And although these people weren't quite as angry that we returned from the war unharmed, they were not very friendly toward Jews. But they accepted us in any case. I wanted to just make a comment about a movie made by a director that probably older people will know quite well. His name was Sidney Lumet. He died in around the middle of, I think around 2007. He made many, many movies, over 40 films of all different types.
Mm-hmm.
One of them being called The Pawnbroker. And that was about a man who survived the Holocaust. His family did not. He somehow managed to survive the death camps. And did not, he tried very hard not to think about the Holocaust, but to go on living as much as possible. And that reminded me in watching an interview with him on television. Even this interview was made more than 10 years ago, but they happened to have it on TV again. And the whole point was that in this movie, what he tried to portray was how people did survive the Holocaust. And what it reminded me of was that neither my mother nor I wanted to speak about these events for perhaps 30 years. When I went to school, in 1947, we managed to get into the United States. So I want to tell you a little bit about how that came about. But in any case, when I got to this country, learned English very quickly, and went to school then, rapidly advancing to my grade level, which is about fifth grade. But I never talked about the Holocaust, even though people knew that I was from Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
So if asked, I would just dismiss it and really try to change the subject. My mother talked very little, even to me, about what went on. And so we didn't discuss much of anything until much later in our lives. What Sidney Lumet points out in his movie, The Pawnbroker, was that once this man comes around to realizing that there's nothing he can do to escape the reality of the fact that he was in the Holocaust, that his family was killed, and so on. And he just absolutely can't avoid thinking about it. He suddenly realizes, in seeing people around him, that in reality, it was not. He also came from this part of the world, and he realizes that it was not an organized um, turn of the Hungarians or the Germans to kill the people, but that it was the commoner, which, as I mentioned, I think in one of the earlier discussions, that it was the German, the common German who was willing to kill people. And he in this movie makes the point that it was his neighbors, the people he was friends with. Those were the people who ultimately turned around and turned against the Jews and were killing them. So it wasn't as if there was some strange group of people that did this. It was just ordinary people who, when given permission, as I said in that, I pointed out that book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, that it was Hitler gave permission to people to kill Jews, so they did. And that movie made the point that I think I've lived with for many, many years. Between the time that we were in Košice and the time that we were in Banska Bystrica, it took 2 years for me to be able to get into the United States. Now, I've got to give you a little bit of a complex history. My grandfather, when he was a young man, at about age 18 or so, came to the United States to work for a relative. He wanted to establish himself in the United States. After about 5 years of staying here, he became a citizen of the United States. Then in his early 20s, he went back to Czechoslovakia, got married, and stayed there. His family was wealthy enough to have a fair amount of land and so on. And so Vranov became his home, and his children and so on, they were all born there, and they were all raised there, and he stayed in place. But what happens is the way the law works in the United States is that if you are a child of a citizen, you also qualify to be a citizen immediately. You have to do one thing, and that is set foot in the United States. The two brothers, which were the oldest of the 5 children, and my mother's sister, who was 2 years younger than she, the 3 of them at various times came to the United States and, of course, immediately became citizens. My mother got married, and Illy got married, her youngest sister, never having left that part of the world and never having been in the United States. Had they come to this country, then I too would have had the same privileges that they had of being able to come to the United States and be a citizen. Since she had not, and I said this gets a little complicated, since she had not, I was not able to become a citizen without getting a visa to do so. The story that I got, and I was never able to confirm it, so I'm not sure if this was done all above board or if there were some things going on that provided us with some special privilege of getting through the Czech government and the Russian government. But I was able in 1947 to get a visa and to come to this country. So we took a train from, by this time we went back to Courchevel, so we left there, took a train to Paris, going through Germany. That was my only contact of being in Germany. Went through Berlin on the train.
Or what's left of it at this point.
Yeah, it was pretty still, 2 years after the war, but it was still pretty much in ruins.
Yeah.
And we went to Prague, from Prague then by TWA Airlines, got a flight from there and hopped to Ireland, from Ireland to the United States, and ultimately wound up in this country. So the first day in school, as soon as I got here, my mother was anxious, and I was anxious to become a citizen of the country. I wanted to go to school, and so I showed up there in the typical apparel of children at that time in Europe, of shirt pants and shorts and not anything that looked particularly European, but certainly didn't look American.
Uh-huh.
American children were wearing jeans and long pants and so on, and so my mother immediately went out and purchased some American clothes for me. So we then went on with that. And so I learned English very quickly, just as I had learned Slovak. So I progressed from beginning by speaking Hungarian, then Slovak, then a little Russian, and eventually I'd learned enough Russian to converse with the Russians there, and then eventually English. It was within a couple of months after arriving here that my mother was introduced to someone also who had emigrated from Czechoslovakia, but much earlier, and she and he hit it off very, very well, and she ultimately married him after learning that my father there was no way of finding him, that he was definitely deceased, and so she wound up marrying this man who then adopted me, and so my name last name used to be Frankel, now became Greenwald, and that's where the name Greenwald comes from. In Europe, we didn't have middle names, so I've kept the middle name of Frankel as my middle name. Mm-hmm. So, and since then, I've lived in the United States and tried to become completely acclimated and have, of course, and have lived here, went to school here, and so on. I didn't go back to Czechoslovakia until 50 years after my coming here in 1947. Mm-hmm. So I went back in 1997, found that Košice was not much changed from the time that I left it. But we also made arrangements to go into Russia. Not that I would find any trace of my father particularly, but I wanted to see what Russia was like. I wanted to see what Poland was like, and we went to Auschwitz, much of which I'd say about 90% of that camp had been uh, razed to the ground, and all that remains are a few buildings which contain some evidence of the of it having been a concentration camp, but now made into a kind of a visitor's a tourist attraction. So,
Hmm.
and a lot of people do go there because of that fact. It was the largest camp in Germany. We also went up into the St. Petersburg in Russia, and then back home. I avoided Hungary and Germany during that trip entirely.
Hmm.
I didn't see any point in contributing to the economy of either of those countries, and didn't feel any closeness uh, to those people. So that pretty much wraps up the experiences. As I said earlier, I live with the memories of of those years on a daily basis. There's something that comes to mind, something that raises my perception of what was important at that time. And I hope that you will be able to post some of the photographs that I was able to
Yeah.
gather. None of those were recovered by us. Those were all um, received by because other people had kept photographs. When we left the apartment, as you recall, I mentioned that we left in a great hurry. My mother went back for just a few minutes to grab a few things that were important to us, but she did not have time to take photographs or anything else, any other memorabilia. And so the one thing that became very evident in this country was that the few people that did survive, either by coming here before the war or survived the camps, um, or hid out in various other places from where we were. We became sort of a community of people in Cleveland, Ohio, and that's where I lived for a number of years. Um, I think most of those people have now passed on, and I'm one of the few remaining people who actually survived through the Holocaust time. Um, the the survivors did have children, and so I stay in touch with many of the children who are, for the most part, either first or second cousins to me. And so we maintain a relationship in that way. And they too, like I, are aging, and so pretty soon there won't be many people left who will remember much of the Holocaust. And perhaps some of us will become at least something of an insight to what went on. I know that Spielberg documented many stories, primarily of people who actually went through the camps.
Hmm.
And I think that those documentaries, the film documentaries that he made, are available in the museum in Washington, D.C. I've been to that museum many times, but I've never wanted to particularly see those particular films or the experiences of others. I have enough bad memories of my own. So,
Yeah.
and with that, I think that giving you kind of a little bit of a gloss over some of the details because there's too much detail to get into, but it should give you, as I said, some some kind of a an overview of what happened during that time.
Hmm.
So I think that the last part of this that I need to mention is that I am horrified by what is going on in the world today. The mass murders and the genocides that are going on in various parts of the world, and it is terrible to live long enough to see all that happening all over again, and just like in our case, just like in the movie uh, The Pawnbroker, um, the the reality is that it's people's neighbors who often are the very people who go after them and try to murder them or do murder them. So with that, let's conclude this, and I hope that somebody will at least have take the time to watch and get a little bit of an idea of what happened.
And with that, people, we're going to be concluding this interview. And thank you, Grandpa, for sitting down and discussing this with me. I've heard bits and pieces of this story over my lifetime so far, but it's nice to be able to uh, accumulate all of these experiences in sort of one large overarching timeline.
Yes.
Um, there's going to be one more episode after this where I'm just going to compile all 5 of these episodes into one large one. You guys are free to watch that as well. I have been releasing these things piecemeal, so that way I'm not overloading you guys with information all at once. However, the large mega episode sort of is going to contain more photos, a few more edits when necessary, and it's going to provide more reference material than the individual episodes have provided so far. So I appreciate you guys watching. Thank you guys all for listening, and I hope to see you guys in another video. Have a good one, people.